In the heart of Mesoamerica, where temples kissed the sky and gods demanded blood, rose the mighty empire of the Aztecs. But beneath the grandeur of Tenochtitlan and the deafening cries of war, something quieter stirred, an invisible force working in silence. They were known not by name but by symbol, the silent Jaguars. Spies, informants, shadow warriors of the empire. The Aztec Empire, often remembered for human sacrifices and gold, was also a masterclass in statecraft. At its zenith, Tenochtitlan governed millions through diplomacy, intimidation, and espionage. Their enemies weren't just men on the battlefield. They were studied long before swords clashed. Spies infiltrated rival city-states, learned local tongues, reported back on weaknesses, and even sowed seeds of dissent. From the outside, the Aztecs appeared as brutal conquerors, but in the shadows, they were tacticians. They observed customs, mapped terrains, noted the moods of markets and the strength of city gates. Even in the sacred codices, scribes painted spies not with names, but with subtle marks, jaguars in moonlight, eyes in obsidian. What drove this hidden machinery? It wasn't paranoia alone. The empire sat atop a complex web of alliances, tribute systems, and threats. Information was the lifeblood of control, and the silent jaguars were the arteries. This is their story. The story of the unseen empire. To rule was to see everything. The Aztecs knew this, and so they created a network that stretched far and deep, beyond their borders, into homes of allies and the hearts of enemies. Information was sacred, and the ones who gathered were more than warriors. They were watchers. These agents were not formally called spies, for the Nahuatl language held no single word for espionage as we know it today. Yet their presence was unmistakable. They were often disguised as merchants, traveling priests, or diplomats. Through trade and ceremony, they observed, questioned, and listened. The Aztec merchants, known as Pactica, played a crucial dual role. They were respected for bringing wealth. But within their ranks existed the Nahuatl Mika, elite Pactica, who served as informants. These men were trained in discretion, code, and survival. They remembered everything. Who was king in the rival city? Who had grievances with their ruler? Where the guards posted? This intelligence was not left to chance. Upon return to Tenochtitlan, they were debriefed in quiet chambers. The Huitzilopochtli, the emperor himself, was often the final recipient of this knowledge. In a society obsessed with omens and prophecies, information gave the Aztecs a godlike edge. The silent jaguars ensured that the empire always knew what its enemies dreamt, feared, and plotted. Trade routes in the Aztec world were more than economic lifelines. They were intelligence highways. The Pactica traveled great distances, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific, bearing cacao, jade, obsidian, and secrets. They passed as humble traders, yet their true mission was often surveillance. Some markets served dual purposes, centers of commerce and hubs of intelligence. In cities like Cholula, Sempol, and Tlaxcala, merchant spies move among stalls, chatting casually with locals, observing military drills, and counting warriors. The information flowed back to Tenochtitlan like sacred water. Their gear was designed for stealth. Many carried tlaquillos, codices disguised as trade logs. These pictorial texts had coded messages, sometimes visible only under moonlight or with certain inks. Others wore rings or pendants that concealed poison, in case they were caught. The merchant spies were not always welcomed. In rival cities, they were watched, interrogated, sometimes killed, but their training included diplomacy, escape, and silence. The penalty for failure was high, but the rewards were empire-shifting. Some even turned entire city-states. A well-placed merchant could sway a chief, stir civil unrest, or delay alliances long enough for Aztec armies to strike. Behind every victorious campaign was a string of these shadowy agents, whispers before war. Aztec communication was both brilliant and beguiling. Their pictographic writing system, Codices, was not merely a record of tribute and myth. It was a weapon of intelligence. Codices carried multiple meanings. What looked like a tribute list could be a spy report. A series of dots beside a temple might indicate the number of guards. A bird flying the wrong way could signify rebellion. These symbols were only fully understood by trained tlaquillos, scribes who doubled as interpreters of coded intelligence. In the imperial archives, known as the Amoxicali, not all texts were for public eyes. Certain codices were stored in guarded rooms, where only the emperor and his closest advisors could study them. These black books likely contained maps of rival cities, names of dissenters, and troop movements. The Aztecs believed that to write was to capture divine truth. To them, a well-placed codex could win wars before they began. And the scribes were more than writers. They were handlers of state secrets, agents of the silent Jaguar order. Religion was power in the Aztec Empire, and power required protection. While the priesthood served the gods, some served the emperor's darker needs as well. Priests traveled widely, performing rituals and spreading the Aztec calendar. But beneath their chants, many gathered socio-political intelligence. As respected men of spirit, they could enter temples and royal courts with little suspicion. In conquered lands, they observed which rulers were loyal, which chafed under tribute, and which secretly planned revolt. These priests often delivered their findings through ritual symbols. A god's displeasure, as interpreted by omens or eclipses, might in fact be a veiled warning to the emperor. The duality of faith and espionage made the priest spies uniquely effective. In their hands, incense and sacrifice masked messages of resistance or plots for rebellion. Even the gods, it seemed, were enlisted in the empire's silent war. Behind the lavish ceremonies of the imperial court, the Aztec palace was a hive of silent activity. Spies did not just lurk outside the empire. They were embedded within the court itself. Servants, guards, even concubines were sometimes used to monitor conversations and loyalties. The emperor, or Huey Telatoni, was seen as a living god. But even gods needed protection from betrayal. To safeguard his power, a network of informants whispered between hallways, listening to dissent, recording who met with whom, and interpreting body language as closely as any omen. Ambassadors from vassal states were watched closely. Their gifts were scrutinized, their conversations memorized, their moods evaluated. These diplomatic missions were not just ceremonial. They were tests of allegiance, and often traps for traitors. At the heart of this operation was the Tlacatical, a high-ranking noble who acted as a master of intelligence, war, and internal order. He oversaw security and sometimes personally vetted the information that passed through the palace gates. This inner circle ensured that rebellions were often crushed before they began. The court didn't just perform rituals. It was a theater of surveillance. The throne was guarded not just by warriors, but by silence. Among the most critical duties of the silent Jaguars was to keep watch on subject cities, those who paid tribute to Tenochtitlan but often dreamed of freedom. Some of these cities were enormous, proud, and powerful. Texcoco, Tlaxcala, Huexinco. While diplomacy appeared intact, the empire quietly planted informants in the ruling classes of these city-states. Some were bribed nobles, others coerced servants. They monitored tax collection, religious compliance, and any signs of rebellion. In places like Tlaxcala, which would later become a Spanish ally, anti-Aztec sentiment was strong. The spies reported fiery speeches, unapproved temple rituals, and suspicious military drills. These were red flags, alerts sent back to the imperial court. But the work was perilous. If discovered, spies were often ritually executed, a punishment meant to erase their identity in both this life and the next. Yet they volunteered, believing their sacrifice was for the divine future of the empire. In the final years before the Spanish arrival, it was these rebel states that became the weakest links. Some silent Jaguars turned double agents. Others died in the chaos. But until the very end, they tried to hold the web together, with whispers, not war. Being a silent Jaguar was a life of paradox. You were trained as a warrior, but often died without ever lifting a weapon. You were honored, but never named. You were vital, but expendable. Their training was grueling. Many were selected from noble families, then taken to secret schools where they learned languages, tradecraft, deception, and survival. They were taught to forget their families, to live many lives, and to die without recognition. In times of crisis, they were dispatched alone to volatile regions. Some lived among enemies for months, even years. They married locals, adopted customs, and only occasionally sent messages via encoded textiles or merchant runners. Many never returned. Their names were erased from history not by accident, but by design. The Empire didn't build monuments to spies. Their victory was in being forgotten. Still, the Empire owed them everything. For every battle won, there was likely a Jaguar in the shadows who had mapped the enemy's path, counted their spears, and sabotaged their spirit. In Aztec belief, warriors who died in battle rose to become stars. One wonders what became of the spies. Perhaps they became the darkness between the stars, ever watching. When Hernan Cortés landed on the shores of Veracruz in 1519, it was not a total surprise to the Aztecs. Months before his arrival, news had traveled inland through the spy network. Merchant spies and priest informants reported sightings of strange ships, pale-skinned men with thundersticks, and unfamiliar animals. Moctezuma II, the emperor at the time, received these reports in dread. Some claimed gods had returned. Others saw invaders. Moctezuma dispatched multiple informants to follow Cortés' route. Along the way, they recorded alliances, betrayals, and the growing army of indigenous rebels that marched beside the Spanish. Despite this intelligence, the emperor hesitated. His spiritual advisors whispered that these foreigners might fulfill old prophecies. And so, he chose diplomacy over war, a fateful decision. Spies still tried to warn him. Codices arrived with signs of treachery. Agents reported Tlaxcalan leaders plotting rebellion. But the empire had become too dependent on myth, too rigid in ritual. The information was accurate, but ignored. The silent Jaguars watched as the empire unraveled, their reports drowned by superstition and fear. They did their duty until the end, but could not save an empire that had stopped listening. Today, the Aztec Empire is remembered for pyramids, warriors, and gods, but not for the intelligence that once held it together. Yet, the silent Jaguar shaped the fate of millions. Their stories live on in fragments. Some codices hint at unnamed travelers who shifted the balance of war. Oral histories speak of quiet men who vanished before battles. Archaeologists still find hidden messages in trade items, in patterns etched into stone. Modern historians now see the Aztecs as more than warriors. They were diplomats, master strategists, and pioneers of espionage. They knew the value of intelligence long before the West coined the term. Their system, though lost conquest, set a precedent in the Americas. That power lies not just in armies, but in information. That victory belongs to the one who listens, watches, and waits. The Jaguar, stealthy, powerful, and revered, was their symbol. But the real Jaguars walked in silence. They carried no spears, left no graves, and built no pyramids. But they left behind an invisible empire, etched in fear, loyalty, and shadow. And now, centuries later, their whispers still echo, if you know where to listen. If you thought you knew the Aztecs, think again. Hit subscribe for more secrets from the shadows of history, only on the Crit Stories. And remember, history doesn't whisper, it spies.